Bend Sinister by Vladimir Nabokov. So, Vladimir Nabokov, one of my personal favorite writers, and truly just one of the greatest to ever do it. I mean, Nabokov was really one of history's top tier writers. And this book, Bend Sinister, is, I think, the second book that he ever wrote in English. And that's part of what makes Nabokov so remarkable is that he was such a master writer in a language which wasn't even his native tongue. But this book, I think, is the second book that he ever wrote in English, and I think it was the first book that he ever wrote while living in America. And it is unique, I believe, in his body of work because it is a book which may or may not say something, which may or may not impart something of the author's own perspective. And I say it's unique for that because Nabokov really wasn't that kind of writer. In fact, this book comes with an introduction by Nabokov in which he kind of advises the reader not to read the book as any kind of allegory, not to read too deeply into it or anything like that, because Nabokov didn't really get down like that. Most of the books of like the 20th century classic books that are regarded as classics are so because they kind of engage with various issues or ideas. They're kind of about something, so to speak. Like a lot of them have like a message to impart. And Vladimir Nabokov really didn't get down like that. Again, he says, as he says in the introduction to this, he loathed allegory and he didn't like social novels or novels that had some kind of message to impart. He didn't really get down like that. But Bend Sinister, I think, may be an exception to that. And even though he kind of distances himself from that in the introduction by saying you're not supposed to read it as some kind of personal statement of me or any kind of allegory, I think that may be an example of methinks he doth protest too much, because I do think that this book offers an intimate insight into its author's mentality, and I'll try to explain what I mean by that. So, Bend Sinister, before we get off into discussing the story and the technical aspects of that story, let's talk about the title to this book, because the title of this book is, I think, one of the most brilliant titles to any book ever. I think this is truly one of the most brilliantly titled books. So, Bend Sinister, that phrase, as Nabokov explains in the introduction, is a reference to like heraldry in heraldic terms. A bend sinister denotes, as pictured on here, a kind of slanting line or something across a shield, an emblem, so to speak, and it comes from heraldry, and I think this is a bend sinister, I believe. And he says that this symbol is often, although erroneously, thought to denote bastardy. So it kind of has a subtle little hidden meaning in there, but also it's obviously kind of a pun. It denotes kind of a wrong turn, a sinister bend in the road, so to speak, because Bend Sinister is a dystopian novel. And that's pretty interesting. And it's also, I think, unique in Nabokov's bibliography because of that as well. Now, this book is a dystopian novel which was published in 1947. That is actually 2 years prior to probably the most famous dystopian novel ever, which is George Orwell's 1984. And this book was subsequently eclipsed by Orwell's book, and also it was eclipsed by certain later of Nabokov's other works, namely Lolita, to the point where it's not really talked about all that much anymore, which I think is a real shame, because I think Bend Sinister has a lot to offer. I think it's a pretty great book. So, like I said, it's a dystopian novel taking place in an unnamed European country, which has been overtaken by a dictator named Paddock. I think that's how you pronounce it, Paddock, who has instituted a social philosophy called equilism. And it's spelled Ekwilism, I think, equilism, equalism, i.e., communism, basically. And this is where this kind of overlaps with Nabokov's own life, because as we know, Nabokov was the child of a rather aristocratic family in Russia, which he had to skedaddle after the Russian Revolution, the Communist Revolution. And this book really does, in light of that fact, feel like it may have something to say, even though its author kind of wants to um, sound like it doesn't. But anyway, so this unnamed, unspecified country is taken over by a dictator named Paduk, and is ruled by a social philosophy called equalism, which is basically communism. And the main character of the book is a man named Adam Krug. And Adam Krug is a world renowned philosopher. And as the book opens, his wife has just died, leaving him the single parent of his young, like 8-year-old son named David. And the book is really about him trying to um, care for his son and provide for his son and kind of shield his son from um, the horrors of this police state, basically. All the while, this police state is trying to manipulate Krug into endorsing them to give them a greater image of validity and esteem on the world stage by forcing this world renowned philosopher to endorse them and kind of puff up their regime, so to speak. And so Krug is kind of trying to navigate not lending his aid to a totalitarian regime, and also trying to shield his son and care for his son um, in this rather hostile milieu. So that's basically the plot. And I will say this in the course of this review, I'll probably end up spoiling this book because I think I may have to talk about some of the more interesting aspects of this book's writing, especially which become apparent at the end of the book. So just be warned, leave now or forever hold your peace. I may spoil this, but anyway, the tone of this book is interesting because Vladimir Nabokov is noted for having kind of a snarky tone to his books. Like Lolita, despite being a book concerned with a rather grotesque subject matter and a story that kind of could alienate some people, it is nonetheless one of the most humorous, at times just flat out hilarious books that you'll ever read. It is rife with humor, and his overall, like this I think is like the fourth of his books that I've read, and the other books are like that. Like Pale Fire is really kind of a funny book, even if it's kind of morbid, dark humor. Nabokov was still kind of a cheeky guy when it came to writing, and his books often have an ample degree of humor to them. And Ben Sinister is no different. There is kind of some almost like absurdist humor in this. It verges on like Kafka-esque territory at times, but it's also very, very dark at other times. In fact, by the end, it gets significantly darker than any of the other books of his that I've read, including Lolita. And that's, that you would think that would be, given what that book is about, you would think that would be like the darkest book in his catalog. But this one gets surprisingly dark by the end, and it really kind of hits you. It's pretty powerful. So Krug is eventually kind of co-opted by the regime, and they use his son to extort him into giving them his endorsement and helping them um, gain a greater appearance of legitimacy. But unfortunately, his son is killed by them, and that, like I said, it gets pretty dark. And it really is quite effective in eliciting a reaction from the reader because it is a very emotional book, even though it is kind of cheeky and snarky at times. When it needs to be, it is very, very powerful. And as Nabokov said in the introduction to this book, what the real heart of the story is about, it's not about totalitarianism or communism or anything. It's about a father trying to do right by his son, and I think it pulls that off with remarkable aplomb, because it hits pretty hard when you get to the end of this book. And his son dies. It hits pretty hard. I mean, you don't really see that coming. But then we get to the ending of this book, and that's where things get really, really interesting. And so another thing about Nabokov that I always appreciate so much is his ability to toy with the very structure of narrative. Like Pale Fire is one of the most narratively inventive books ever. Like it is a book that kind of pushed new ground. It's very, very inventive in terms of the way that story is told. Um, and Ben Sinister has some similar tricks to it that you may not be aware of at the outset. So at various points in this book, the narration slips from third person into first person, but you're not sure whether it's like the character in the book speaking in first person, or whether it's like the narrator, whether it's the author himself directly identifying themselves in the narration. And by the end of this book, as Krug is about to have his um, meeting with Paddock, the dictator, with whom he was actually like a schoolmate. That's another kind of interesting aspect of his relationship to the regime. He and Paddock were actually like schoolmates back when they were boys, and Krug was actually like a bully to him and kind of like tormented him. So there's really no love lost between them, either one. But anyway, so at the end of the book, Krug is going to meet Paddock to negotiate whatever he's going to do or not do for the regime. But then he has kind of a revelation, so to speak. And the revelation is that he kind of, I think, if I'm interpreting this right, he realizes that he is a character in a book. And by the end of this, that the like literally the very end of the story, as Krug is brutally gunned down um, by the regime, Nabokov it stops the story and like identifies himself and like steps back and kind of reminds us that this was all just a story to begin with. It's not real. It's just a product of the author's imagination. So it goes heavily metafictional by the end, and I did not see that coming. Again, I knew that Nabokov, often liked to do those kind of tricks with his books, but I didn't really see that coming, and it really surprised me. By the time I got to the end of this book, I was truly caught off guard with how metafictional it got, and just the way that it concluded itself, which was probably not what most, if any, readers of this book will expect. But I liked it. Came right out of left field, and it was surprising, but it worked. Like it worked. Like you get to the end where Krug is like gunned down, and you're like, dang, that's a bleak ending. But then Nabokov just like steps back and like, it's only a story. This is just a product of my imagination, and it kind of it kind of adds a little relief in there to the kind of bleakness that the story has embodied by that point. Um, so yeah, that is the story of Ben Sinister. It takes some interesting turns. I'll definitely say some turns I didn't see coming, but I respect it so much for that, and I respect Nabokov's boldness with this story, his willingness to kind of just kind of merge two separate genres together, dystopian fiction and metafiction. I really did like it. I thought the story was highly enjoyable to me. But now let's talk about the technical aspects of this book, because I do have some criticisms, or mainly one big criticism of this book. And that has to do with the writing. The writing of this book, it feels purple. It really does. And I don't really like to say that because Nabokov is one of the most respected prose stylists ever. I mean, that's why he is held in such a high regard as a writer, because he was a master of writing. Like Lolita is one of the most brilliantly written books ever. But Lolita was him like kind of at the peak of his powers, at the top of his game, firing on all cylinders. This book predates Lolita, and it's not as flawless, I don't think. This writing, it's not that the writing is like dull or heartless. It's quite the opposite. It's too much. It is too much. I thought like this was some serious like try hard, look at me style writing. There are a lot of sentences, a lot of lines in this book that felt like like honestly, I don't even know how to interpret some of the lines in this book because it it's just too abstract at times. Like there's it although really did enjoy the story quite a bit, the writing felt to look at me. It was try hard writing. I feel. I mean, you can say, well, Vladimir Nabokov, one of the greatest writers ever, by your own admission, and yes, he is. But this book, the writing in this felt unwieldy. Like it was too much, too flashy, too overly ornate. It's like purple prose at times. I did have some serious issues with the writing because there are some lines in this book that are kind of borderline gibberish. Honestly, I thought. So I gotta knock a little bit for the writing because I think he needed to rein it in quite a bit with this. Um, I think he needed to not go quite as all in with the artsiness of the prose as he did. But anyway, as for the characters, I think he got the job done good enough. Krug is kind of like the only real character that has depth in here, but I think he was sufficiently rendered to where it is impactful when you get to the end and his son dies. That hits hard, and then when he dies, even though by then you know that he's like a fictional character, so he can't really die. But even when he meets his ultimate fate, it hits hard, and you kind of do get behind him. And as I said, he and Paddock, the dictator, were like schoolmates as boys, and um, he was kind of like a bully to Paddock, and so it's kind of it's an interesting dynamic. I'll say that he's kind of like this like Chad figure kind of, and then Paddock is like this kind of pathetic little whelp. And that brings me to what I said at the beginning, where I think this book has some insights into Nabokov's mindset, especially as regards what happened to his home country of Russia. Um, so in Orwell's book, 1984, Orwell portrayed, totalitarianism, authoritarianism, tyranny as like this grand, sinister um, thing that exists to just shit on the individual and just stamp out all nonconformity and just kind of it's just an absolute and utter control of the individual's life. And that definitely is in Ben Sinister here, but Nabokov's perspective on tyranny seems to be a little bit different. Um, and honestly, reading this book, I was reminded of another and much, much more divisive Russian expat writer who also wrote about tyranny. And I was struck by the seeming similarity between these two Russian expat writers as regards their perspectives on despotism. So, in Ayn Rand's book Anthem here, the regime in this book, the villainous government, it's not just that they're villainous, it's that it's the tyranny of mediocrity, it's the tyranny of stupidity. And I was really struck by Nabokov's seeming outlook in Ben Sinister because it seems to evince a similar perspective to that of Ayn Rand's book. It's not just that it's tyranny, it's the tyranny of mediocrity. It's the pathetic rabble um, pulling down the truly great individuals of society. Because Krug in this book is like a very individualistic figure. He doesn't really he views the politics of equalism is just complete crap. In fact, Nabokov actually, I believe, in his introduction here, says that he peppers extracts from Vladimir Lenin's speeches throughout this book. So there again, it has a tie to Nabokov's actual past. Um, but we also have to remember that Nabokov himself was not only the child of an aristocratic family, but he was probably a genius himself, and I don't mean that just in like in a literary way. I mean literally like in all around. I think Nabokov very well may have been like a genius or close to it, a very high intellect type character. And so I was just struck reading Ben Sinister by the kind of apparently similar outlook on like um, dictatorship and communism as to like Anthem, because it again, it's not that the dictatorship is this grand sinister thing of these calculating evil schemers. It's just stupid. Like it's just pitiful lesser people pulling down the truly great members of society. Again, it feels as though Nabokov's perspective on this is not it's not like Orwell's, because he even says in his introduction that he viewed Orwell as a mediocre crap writer. He was a very opinionated man, but it seems like he views tyranny. He views communism is it's just the tyranny of mediocrity, of stupidity. Because again, in like Anthem, the government, the villainous regime, and they're just afraid of knowledge. They're technophobic, and it's kind of like that in Ben Sinister, because Krug is like this world-renowned philosopher, a very um, high-level intellect in his own right, and again, he is kind of just dragged down to the level of his inferiors. And so, again, Nabokov can say in his introduction all he wants about, don't read it as an allegory, don't take it too much to heart. But again, methinks he does protest too much. I think this really is kind of an insight into his mind, to an extent at least. And I think it's of his novels at least. I mean, he did write Speak Memory, which is like his autobiography. But of his novels, I think this is the most personal and the most revealing of anything that he wrote. I think this is the one that came most like from his own personal standpoint. So yeah, Ben Sinister. That is Ben Sinister by Vladimir Nabokov. To rate this book, it's kind of tricky because it teeters on the brink of B plus or A minus territory for me. I'll say right now, this is now I think the fourth book of his that I've read. I actually have a few more of his books around here on my shelves that I haven't got to yet. But of the books of his that I've read so far, I think this is probably my personal favorite, just because the story struck me more. Like, I mean, I love Lolita. Lolita is like a better book, but I enjoyed the story of this more. And I enjoyed this more than Pale Fire, and I enjoyed this more than Invitation to a Beheading. Um, I really responded to the story of this because it's pretty powerful and it's grittier than your typical Nabokov fare. And also, but it still has that kind of inventive flair with the metafictional ending of it. So I really did love the story of this book, but the writing, I had some issues with the writing, and you know, other people might not. Other people might say, you know, it's gorgeously written, and it does have some. I mean, it is a cut above like your typical fare. I mean, it is Nabokov after all, but still, some of the lines in this book were just a little bit much. It needed to be reined in a little bit, I think. So, but you know, as much as I did enjoy it, and as much as that metafictional ending hooked me, because again, I'm a sucker for metafiction. I absolutely love metafiction. I love when an author can do something like that. So I'll take off. It's not getting an A plus, and it's not even getting just a flat A, but I'll give it an A minus, knocking some points for the writing. But it still makes it into the A territory, so I'll give it an A minus just because I personally enjoyed it so much, even though the writing I think needed to be not quite so unruly as it got. But yes, I'll give Ben Sinister an A minus. I think this book, it's a shame. I think that this is so overshadowed both by later dystopian novels, but also just by Nabokov's own later works. Because I think this book is a fantastic book. I loved it. I think that Ben Sinister is a great book. Um, So yeah, Ben Sinister by Vladimir Nabokov. I'm giving it an A minus. Have you read Ben Sinister? Let me know down in the comments what you thought about it, whether you have agreed or disagreed with any of my takes on it here today. And if you haven't read Ben Sinister, I could recommend it. Again, the writing gets a little bit purpley, actually a lot bit purpley at times, but overall the story, it kept me hooked. I did not know where it was going, and I really did not see the ending coming. But it was interesting, and it hit hard at times. It really hit hard, but it also still had that kind of snarky Nabokovian wit to it. Just a really great book, and yeah, I could definitely recommend this. I think it's a very worthwhile book and kind of an underrated gem now. And as always, if you have enjoyed anything you've seen or heard here today, remember to hit that like button and subscribe. I would really appreciate it. And until next time, peace.